Welcome to Omega Matters. I'm Kristina, and this is Bill, and this is Omega Matters, where we talk about all things omega-3s. Today, we're talking with Brenna, Dr. Tom Brenna, about seafood and pregnancy. And Dr. Brenna is a professor of pediatrics at the Dell Medical School at the University of Texas at Austin. He received his PhD from Cornell University in analytical chemistry and spent 28 years as a professor of human nutrition at Cornell in Ithaca, New York. He's received several awards from the American Society for Nutrition and served on a number of advisory panels on human nutrition, including being a member of the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which is the group that is tasked with updating the U.S. dietary guidelines. His work has been in the area of requirements for polyunsaturated fatty acids in the perinatal period and the development of advanced analytical chemical instrumentation and high precision isotope ratio mass spectrometry for anti-doping applications. But lucky for you all, we are only focusing on the omega-3 work today. Thank you for joining us, Tom.
Well, thanks for asking me.
Yes, this is great. So to start off, we are focusing today on seafood and pregnancy. And how did this topic become controversial? How did we get to a point where women were told to avoid seafood in pregnancy?
Okay, well, that's a really good opening question. It was the 1990s, really the late 1990s, that concerns about the detectability of mercury specifically that had been measured in various fish, let's say, in the 80s and 90s. Towards the end of that period, it began to become of some concern that because it was measurable, there may be some health effects. Now, we know from poisoning events, that is cases in which, let's say, there is a release of mercury into a body of water where it would be ingested by pregnant women, that mercury is a neurotoxin. So between the natural history of mercury, and when I say natural history, I mean we don't do science in toxins the way we do in nutrition. We can't feed people toxins and look at the outcome. What we can do is see what the natural history is, and then we assess the consequences. So it was in the late 1990s that people began to be concerned that the detectable amount of mercury in various fish might have an effect on the developing fetus and the brain of the developing fetus. So I would say that out of an abundance of caution and very little direct data on the consumption of seafood, the EPA and FDA issued, let's say, statements of concern that women ought to be careful about the amount of seafood they were eating during pregnancy in relation to it being a neurotoxin and possibly limiting the mental development of their children. It was probably 5 years after that a committee was constituted. I think it was 2004, but it was in the 00s sometime, where a committee was put together, an advisory committee, to have a look at whatever data were available. And at that time, they mostly looked at just the levels of mercury in various fish and listed them from, let's say, the highest to the lowest levels of mercury, and said, well, these are high, and so maybe these top ones you'd want to stay away from. But an important caveat to that statement is that they were high relative to other fish, but that doesn't mean they were high relevant to some kind of a biologically relevant level. In other words, no one at that time really knew how much mercury was enough to start to see effects.
Mhm.
And so those are sort of two of the major events with respect to regulatory bodies that led us to the concerns over mercury. And then there was a bit of a, I don't know, I think well, I guess we call it a meme that got started, and folks said, okay, yeah, well, I'm pregnant, I ought to stay away from fish. That's what they say.
Mhm.
And it just got started that way. I think that's a reasonable synopsis of the early events.
Yeah, kind of spiraled a little bit beyond what the first like regulations and science were. They were trying to give a little warning, but in pregnancy, everything gets heightened. And if there's any risk at all, people tend to be, especially around food. There's so many weird foods that you end up having to avoid for a variety of reasons. So it feels like it's something that kind of got out of control. And then we start to learn more about how fish intake impacts pregnancy outcomes in general, not just looking at mercury, but looking at fish and seafood intake. And can you kind of summarize a little bit of that history and where we are now there?
Yeah. So many of us come to a overall foods perspective through, let's say, study of a nutrient. Researchers do that, right? So we're talking about omegas here and omega-3s. And the omega-3s have been a subject of interest for quite a few decades. Every so often someone who's new to it says to me, hey, people have been interested in omega-3s recently. And I say, hey, recently is like, I don't know how many decades. So this idea has been around for a long time. The very first detection of our big omega-3 DHA in any tissue was actually in brain. And that was back in the 50s. And so there's been sort of studies, and I mean, I would say that in the 70s, it was a little more cardiovascular, and then it drifted into the brain realm with the matter of premature infants and whether they were getting enough omega-3s.
Yeah.
But if I then shift to the fish story, fish is the major source of omega-3s in the diets, the long chain omega-3s in the diet, EPA and DHA. And because of other factors in the diet, that becomes really the major source. And so if you believe that a preformed version of DHA is required, then you start looking to fish. Many nutritionists don't like recommending supplements. I mean, I've been around long enough so I've seen it go way towards supplements and then way away from supplements. So I don't know whether it's going to go back again, but if you then say, okay, well, I want a foods-based approach, and the dietary guidelines very specifically addresses only foods. So recommending supplements is not part of the mission of that organization, of that effort. So you say, well, okay, so seafood is where you get it from. There's no place else to get it from, to speak of, that is omega-3s, long chain omega-3s. But the other thing about seafood is that it's loaded with other nutrients. I mean, in addition to being, well, mostly meat is what we eat in seafood, so it'll be the protein and so on, but also a nice complement of minerals, which many of us think are really important for development of the brain as well. So you begin to think, well, okay, now how important is this mercury story, and how much evidence is there that it's relevant as a toxin?
Yeah, so risk benefit analysis started to come into focus.
Yes, that's exactly right. A risk benefit analysis started to come into focus is exactly right.
And did somebody actually do a risk benefit analysis in pregnancy?
Well,
softball.
Yeah, the earliest one that was really a a risk benefit thing. It started out only risk would be the study in the Seychelles Islands.
Okay.
And the idea in the Seychelles Islands was that two toxicologists went to the Seychelles Islands, which is a group of islands that are kind of isolated. They're in the Indian Ocean, and they eat 10 times more fish than Americans eat, probably more than that. And they said, right, we're going to go there and we're going to measure the mercury in mom's hair. And then we're going to look at the IQ of the kids and those kinds of things, how they do in school and so on. And we think there's going to be a real issue with all the mercury they're eating. And they started that. This was at the University of Rochester. Those guys are still around, Gary Myers and Phil Davidson.
Okay.
And so they went and they did these measurements started that study probably in the late 80s.
Wow.
And lo and behold, when they looked at hair mercury in mom and how the kids were doing, they found almost no relationship. They even found a little bit of a positive relationship where mom's hair mercury is higher and the kids actually are smarter. So that I remember listening to the first time I listened to one of those descriptions, and I before they got to that plot, I thought to myself, I wonder whether actually mercury is going to look good, and it did. So both of those fellows who were toxicologists are really converts, more and really early on in the game, earlier than.
So how'd they explain that connection between higher mercury and better outcomes?
Just correlation. I mean, mercury was a marker for fish consumption. And so mercury is just the more fish they ate, the more mercury they had. That was the explanation, and that's what made sense to me. That's why I was sort of smiling when I was listening to it, thinking, I bet you they're going to be surprised at what they find. It isn't going to be downward; it's going to be upward, and it's slightly upwards. That's what they find.
Yeah. Well, at least it wasn't downward.
That's correct. At least it wasn't downward. That's exactly correct. That's exactly correct.
Mm-hmm.
There was another study that's very relevant. There were various other studies around, but there was another one that was sort of in the 90s and continued on, and that was in the Faroe Islands. The Faroe Islands are in the North Sea, north of Scotland. I guess they're between Scotland and Iceland or somewhere like that. And in that study, those folks have very high levels of mercury in their blood and in their hair. And the reason is because they consume pilot whale. They have a traditional pilot whale hunt every so often. I don't know, annually, twice annually, I don't know. And their cultural food is basically pilot whale meat and blubber. And their levels of mercury, and I'm going from memory, but I think they're something like 20 times higher than, let's say, a reference level in the United States.
Wow.
So if mercury was a problem there, you'd expect to see huge effects, wouldn't you? You'd expect to see real problems, lots of people whose biology can't handle it. I mean, we do know about nutritional conditions that cause problems with brain development. The classic one that comes to mind is iodine deficiency, which you could say causes retardation. So you'd almost say, okay, well, if it's 20-fold higher on the Faroe Islands, maybe we should see things that look like that, and you don't see anything like that. You see maybe a little effect, but again, that's pilot whale. And it's not seafood. And there are some explanations why there may be a difference between pilot whale and actually finfish and shellfish and seafood in general.
You got a big dose issue there too.
Sorry?
You have a big dose issue. You said the intake is vastly higher than just maybe eating 12 ounces of seafood a week.
Oh, absolutely. No, the numbers, it's almost like, from a scientific point of view, forget about a humanity point of view, it's kind of almost a nice experiment, because you say, okay, well, those guys are eating so much they've got 20 times as much. And that was average, actually. 20-fold it was 20-fold higher on average. That means there are a lot of people that are higher than that.
Yeah.
Still, you don't see major problems. So that was a bit of a clue that maybe mercury is not as important at the levels that Americans would get it in commercial seafood.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about isolated bodies of water that might actually be polluted. That's something else, right? So nobody's suggesting.
Yeah, the little lake down the road here where the coal plant dumps its crap into it. We're not talking about the fish from that lake.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, you actually do see some mercury in that can be associated with that, with those pollutants. Some, and then there are places where mercury, actually gold mines, where mercury comes with gold, and when it's smelted, there's just mercury all over the place, and then mercury dumped into the streams. None in the United States that I know of, but I know there are places in Africa where you have that.
Wow. So with those two studies, Seychelles and Faroe Islands, both kind of singing the same song in a way, it still seemed like there was a huge uphill climb to get the federal regulations to get off this mercury scare. Well,
I'm not even sure we're off it yet.
Okay.
What people did, and when I say people, it's the company I keep, but what researchers did was they started looking at this question, and so asking how much seafood does a pregnant mom consume, and what is the consequences for the neurodevelopment of their kids.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the let's say that those studies started to really be published in earnest in the 2010s, let's say.
Okay.
And the federal government did a modeling study in sort of around this period, and I forget exactly what year that was, but where if you look carefully at, say, how much seafood a mom would consume of various species, you see that the benefits from the omega-3s, and you can focus on omega-3s, you can say just omega-3s if you like. I mean, there's also other nutrients in there, but the benefits for the omega-3s would just swamp any what I call hypothetical harm from the mercury. And the reason I call it hypothetical harm is because the only way you can even quantify it is by doing what we science guys call a regression analysis. And so you assume there's a little harm, and you say, okay, well, if there is a little harm all the way down to zero and even a little bit, then we can ascribe a little bit of harm to mercury. But I'm not even sure that's accurate, to be perfectly honest.
Whatever
so,
it is,
yeah, I mean, it's a multiple regression, and you're extracting something, but nobody has been fed mercury and showing harm. And I just cited those other two cases. And we do have ways of dealing with mercury. It comes out the hair. That's one way.
Yeah.
It was, let's see, I tend to think in eras, as I think you probably detected from the way I think of things. And yeah, it was in preparation for the 2020 dietary guidelines that a group of us got together and said, right, what is the actual evidence around seafood consumption, not omega-3 consumption, not mercury consumption, no nutrients specifically, just seafood consumption. What's the evidence around that? And child development.
Yeah.
Intake and pregnancy and child development. And we chose to replicate as best we could the procedures that the dietary guidelines would rely upon, that are actually developed by the USDA.
Okay, right.
And so, in a manner of speaking, we decided that we would find out what they were going to get when they did the analysis.
You're right.
Oh, yeah.
You did it for them.
Indeed. And I would also point out that the USDA and FDA, who are responsible for the dietary guidelines, like to say that the methods they use are transparent, meaning you can replicate them.
Mhm.
And so if they're transparent and they can be replicated, then a group of a dozen senior scientists looking at those procedures ought to be able to replicate them. And it was quite a summer of 2019, as we were on the phone an awful lot with each other, going over paper after paper, and that is research paper after research paper. And we ultimately concluded that seafood consumption, even at the highest level, is beneficial. If you take 20-something studies, all measuring many different outcomes, so not just IQ, but all sort of, performance in school, all kinds of things, you will sometimes just randomly, even if there's no effect, you'll see things that that might look negative. We saw hardly any that looked negative, and no pattern that made any sense that would make any concern. So the pattern overall was, the more seafood mom ate in pregnancy, the better neurocognitively that the kids got in school and later, and to pretty much a plateau level. And it never came down again up to,
what's the
What's
we were
numbers we're talking about?
The highest number we found was about 100 ounces a week of seafood, which is getting to be in the realm of what a shark eats. And so that's an awful lot. And and our recommendation is 12 ounces a week, although the 12 ounces a week, it's a long story how people got to that number, but it was certainly not evidence-based.
Yeah,
It was
right.
more or less pulled out of a hat. But that 12 ounces a week is kind of the reference level. And we said, we got to pick a number. So we picked 12, and 12 is okay. So, but this is up to 100. So the margin for safety is enormous.
Huge. And 12 ounces is 3 servings, 2 or 3 servings, depending on how big your fish is. So it's really reasonable.
It's not very much,
not a lot.
The old idea of 2 to 3 fish meals a week.
Not bad.
So not a bad guide.
Good baseline for sure.
Yeah. So didn't we move from wording that said no more than to at least? Or are we hoping to get there?
I should also say that after we finished that project, I'm just remembering, we presented some of that. We published that study, we presented it, and I forgot to mention that despite all the experience that those researchers had, that all of us had in this world, we were actually surprised that the data were as positive as they were. We thought we might, digging through everything, find something. It just was great. So we also we presented some of that stuff to the dietary guidelines, and we were really amazed at how the committee not only accepted much of what we said, and the data that they were handed also was consistent with what we said, and they even went further in the recommendations. Now, this was the advisory committee. All of that recommendations did not get into
the final
dietary guidelines for Americans, but boy, we went a long way. And then in the following year, 2021, the FDA's job is then to update the advice to consumers from the dietary guidelines for Americans. Dietary guidelines for Americans is more or less for professionals, even though it's widely reported in the press. It's more or less for a registered dietitian, medical doctors that care about nutrition, and more professionals. So the FDA updated the advice, and we did a couple of listening sessions with them, and they were glad to listen to us. And they did start to emphasize the positive, they started to emphasize the neurocognitive benefits of fish. They still had the mercury story, but they pushed it down low. And
Great.
I'd like to see them get rid of it.
Right. Well, maybe next step.
Yeah.
Maybe next step. We're making progress, you know, decade after decade, we're making progress.
Decade by decade.
Pace of
Right.
research and policy.
Yeah.
I've been really on the record saying that the danger about seafood and pregnancy is not eating enough seafood.
Yep.
Danger is not eating
Danger
enough.
is not eating enough, not eating it. Right.
Yeah, you've got to eat seafood. Moms should be eating seafood. If they don't eat seafood, that's dangerous.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Avoiding it. Yeah.
Avoiding it is dangerous.
Mhm.
And so that, you know, I don't want to, I don't think it's productive or even accurate to make demons and say, you know, oh boy, you know, there's some bad guys 20 years ago told, you know, who went in the wrong direction. That's why I think the abundance of caution view is accurate. I mean, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that the EPA and the FDA said, hey, you know, there's something to this mercury stuff. Maybe we should be careful about it. But as you said, it kind of spiraled and really scared women.
Yeah. And it's very human story. It's how, like, when science bumps up into human nature, sometimes it's not what was intended.
Yeah.
And now it's taken to, like, the fear factor is really powerful, especially in pregnancy, I feel like. And so the work that you guys have done to really show, like, this has been looked at the extremes, and when it's coming from fish, mercury is not it's not affecting the kid outcomes. And so that's,
Well, it's certainly not
it's a
blunting.
start.
It's not blunting the good effects of fish.
Right.
It really isn't. It's the mom and baby need the nutrients.
Right.
Mhm.
There's pretty good evidence that mom needs the nutrients too. I mean, it's the story of mom's mental health and, you know, postpartum depression and that sort of thing. And those nutrients are important there too. EPA particularly is at least the way the data look.
Mhm.
I like to say DHA for IQ and EPA for mood.
Yeah.
So,
And that's kind of, yeah.
Yeah, that's probably a good way to wrap this up. I think we
Yeah.
better hang it up. So
This is great. It's just really it was really good to see how, like, research and policy and all of this kind of comes together when you're talking about the dietary guidelines and recommendations and how it affects people's lives. And so we've through, like, Seafood Nutrition Partnership, been able to kind of see how this process has gone, and we thank you for this work. Hope it keeps going. It will keep going. And it's a pretty major impact. It's kind of hard to appreciate how big it could be. So thank you so much for joining us. We have a lot of other things we'd love to talk to you about, so maybe we'll have to pull you back for a completely different topic. But thank you so much.
always fun to speak with both of you.
great. Thank you, Tom.
Bye.
Okay.
Sure.